Have you been confused about human history and the many ways used to explain history and the events of history? Because despite the plethora of explanatory narratives, the cause of history has not been explained by the theories. The doctrine of the three generations is a theoretical construct that explains history in terms of three personality types. Each personality type is linked to a historic period and a political position. These periods are called generations because they are attached to a personality type that is expressed as a political position. The first generation is liberal, the second is what we call conservative, and the third is a priorian, or what the Bible tells us is a Christian. The first generation is a style of life initially associated with hunter-slash-gatherers. As a way of life, it is not able to produce much beyond a subsistence culture. We also know that when it manifests as communism, it tends to cause economic stagnation. The highest level that first-generation economics reached is what we know of as the culture of the American settler. The mythos of the American settler is the cult of the independent individual who served as his own court of justice and market. The Wild West was probably the closest to anarchy the world has come. The ideal American settler was totally self-sufficient, legally and economically. In reality, most Americans in the West still needed the trading post or general store to provide basic staples such as pork belly, beans, flour, and coffee. The Second Amendment was a direct result of first-generation thinking. Justice was ultimately a product of the individual members of the community who under duress could form into bands for mutual protection. However, because an American settler's overhead was so low, many could produce a surplus of one kind or another, and so, using this surplus, he could over time become more mechanized using store-bought goods. As he mechanized his farm or small enterprise, he became more attached to the market. Americans easily worked themselves out of the first-generation lifestyle, and as the mother country already had, entered the second-generation stage. In America, because of guns, the settler's neighbor could not make claims on any surplus created by the work of someone else. Even though settlers were dependent on each other to a large degree, individual imitative could lead to large disparities in wealth. A lot has been written about industrialization and the role of Britain in establishing the Industrial Revolution. Obviously, a lot of factors came into play in transforming Britain from the subsistence level to the industrial level. One factor in Britain's favor is that its first-generation economy was at best short-lived, as it is generally understood. According to Grok, husbandry and agriculture in what is now Britain began during the Neolithic period, around 4000 to 2500 BCE. This marked the transition from hunter-gatherer societies to settled farming communities. Here's a concise timeline based on archaeological evidence. In the pre-Neolithic period, before 4000 BCE. Mesolithic hunter-gatherers in Britain relied on wild resources. There is no evidence of systematic agriculture. In the Neolithic Revolution, circa 4000 BCE, agriculture arrived with the spread of Neolithic farming practices from mainland Europe. Early farmers introduced wheat, barley, cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs. By 3500 to 2500 BCE, farming was widespread, with permanent settlements and field systems. The construction of monuments like Stonehenge, circa 3000 BCE, suggests stable agricultural surplus. By the Bronze Age, c. 2500 to 800 BCE, agriculture and animal husbandry were well established, with more advanced tools and expanded field systems. There was intensive farming and pastoralism by this time. Trade was likely common, even though industrialization is considered to have begun in the mid-18th century, roughly 1760 to 1840. Key developments were inventions like the spinning jenny, 1764, water frame, 1769. And steam engine, improved by James Watt, 1776, that mechanized production. The 1780s, 1800s saw the growth of factories, coal mining, and canal networks. Then came the expansion of the rail network. By 1840, Britain was the workshop of the world, with urban centers like Manchester and Birmingham leading industrial output. Several interconnected factors enabled Britain to industrialize earlier and faster than other regions. The first influence was the agricultural revolution, 17th to 18th centuries. Improved farming techniques, e.g., crop rotation, selective breeding, enclosure movement, increased food production, permitted surplus food. This ability to allow people to leave farming is the key step in the development of advanced civilization. England had abundant coal and iron ore deposits to power steam engines and enable iron and later, steel production. Numerous rivers and coasts facilitated transport and trade. A core resource lacking in places like Africa. Additionally, Britain's wealth from trade, e.g., colonial empire, slave trade, provided capital for investment in machinery and infrastructure. The Bank of England, EST 1694, created a stable banking system and provided a source of capital entrepreneurs. England was also a source of the world's major inventions. James Watt, steam engine, Richard Arkwright, water frame, and Abraham Darby, coke-smelted iron. The steam engine enabled factories to operate independently of water power. England underwent a huge population growth, growing from 6 million in 1700 to 10.5 million by 1801. Along with the natural growth in the number of people, the Enclosure Act displaced many rural workers, pushing them into urban factories. For example, Manchester grew from 10,000, 1717, to 180,000, 1851. Along with England's waterways, roadways were built, then railways. Railways reduced coal transport costs by 50% by the 1830s. Britain's empire provided raw materials, e.g., cotton from India, sugar from the Caribbean, and markets for manufactured goods. Britain was also politically stable. There were legal protections for property and patents. This encouraged entrepreneurship. England was also the home to the greatest scientific advancements, which spurred on industrial growth. Industrialization is important and serves as the key indicator of a second-generation system. It is a key indicator because one cannot have industrialization in a subsistence culture. There are not pathways to the accumulation of the necessary capital to create an industrialized nation, in hunter-gatherer societies. Without the production of surpluses, social hierarchies, upon which second-generation systems are fabricated, cannot be formed. If first-generation societies are flat, second-generation systems are defined by steep gradients of social and economic hierarchies. But if we leave things there, we will not understand what is going on. The mores of a hunter-gatherer society were created to prevent free riding. This is the only true problem. A person is either a thief or not. If not, his focus is on countering the scams of parasites. There is and always has been, the expectation of reciprocity. But the need to stop parasites stagnated first-generation societies. Keeping everyone on the same level, kept down social strife and competition, among tribal members, but it never permitted anyone to succeed. However, there was still division based on the two personalities. Some members of the tribe thought the rules of a first-generation community were meant to ensure the harder-working, more successful person had an obligation to share the fruits of his labor with their less energetic neighbor. Whereas those who worked hard saw the duty of others to share with you during hard times, as meaning one had to do their best so as not to be a burden to the tribe. So the division between freeloader and a priorian, person governed by principle, still existed but was largely hidden by the low level of demands placed on those who live at a subsistence level. However, the circumstances that Britain and America encountered made the mechanisms of the tribe irrelevant. The potentialities of the new economy made it impossible for those who benefited from holding everyone down to the same level, from exercising this kind of social oppression successfully. However, the transition from first-generation rules to second-generation mores was not simply a case of allowing each and everyone to do the best as they were able. The disparities were first political. The disparities allowed a class of persons to exist that could marshal private or national armies for defense, either of the political entity or the private fiefdom. In England, the wealth was primarily of the public kind and the armies were national or political in some way. America was more able to produce large pools of private capital along with private armies or security details. However, by the 1700s the political disparities were being mirrored by economic ones as Britain began to industrialize. In America, as the nation prospered, it began to develop more political structure. The difference between first and second generation systems is that the first generation promotes social stability through economic equality, whereas the second generation system promotes progress through large variations in power and wealth. The powerful are unleashed and expected to maintain the social order for their own benefit. The first generation society is composed of equal persons, but it is economically and politically flat. The second generation society is the opposite, full of inequality and power and economic disparities. However, it is more dynamic. However, to fully understand what is going on we have to understand the true division in the world and see these generational social changes as a part of the same war between the same two classes of persons. Indeed, it is a war between modes of consciousness. The Bible tells us there are two races or peoples. They literally are two races because the Bible tells us we must die to the one to become the other. There are the saved and unsaved, the people of the flesh and of the spirit. These groups do not conflate nor overlap. We can have one master, we serve the one and hate the other, or hate one and serve the other. If there are two, non-overlapping groups of humans they constitute two races. The first two groups correspond with the left and right options. The first generation are essentially on the left and promote socialism. This is why they cannot develop and why they constantly tear down anyone who is attempting to get ahead. This is what some call the crabs in a bucket effect, because the crab climbing out is always pulled back in by the ones at the bottom. The second generation group is more akin to the conservatives who are more independent and who generally celebrate the crab who is able to escape the mob below. The third group are overtly or covertly Christian. The ones on the bottom want others to succeed, and the ones who succeed want to help others do well also. Christians move as a single organism. We understand our interdependency. Christians want equality but through inspiration and adaptation, not oppression. Christians want everyone to be the master of their own kingdom but to utilize their wealth for the betterment of all. This kind of world was best reflected in the Britain of the British Empire, a time when every man was expected to do his duty, and for the most part, did. Wealth was not seen as privileged, but as a duty. One did not have power and wealth except as a gift of God to be used to glorify his kingdom. So Britain of this time did prosper and did gain power. However, it never gained the status of a third-generation economic power. To do this it would have had to remove the state, and it could not do this. People either own what they produce or not. The state cannot tell us what we own and what we do not own, nor what claims someone else has on what we created. That is a categorical and unassailable fact, that can only be overcome with guns and a violent gang who care nothing for moral truth or logic.